Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
Well, let's get into this. So today we are talking about anger, specifically anger in children, obviously, but because we're all about family dynamics and connection and everything. I went into, again, in this episode, I did a full lit review of, more than a dozen different research articles or research studies that have been done. Quite interesting. Some with twins, others with just like 3-year-olds and following them through their adolescence and everything. And I'm not going to say I didn't learn anything, but a lot of this stuff I know that you had already been like doing research on. So it was interesting to actually read some of the studies behind what like you've already talked about. Or
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what you were reading when you were trying to research anger was confirming to the stuff that I've already been teaching or telling you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's always good to know that it is based on research, but nothing that you were sharing with me was surprising to me.
No.
That was all stuff I knew.
And to be fair, I did try and seek out research that refutes what you have said about anger. And I really didn't find much that I would give credibility to, like either the studies were way too small or whatever, the design of the study, or they weren't peer reviewed. So anyways, good job on teaching factual information.
That's what I seek to do.
So I wanted to have a discussion with you about, as a psychotherapist, owning a practice, working with other therapists and families and children. I guess let's start with at the beginning. What first drew you to working with children and families? And I think we've kind of asked something similar in previous episodes, but I want to know specifically when it relates to children who show like signs of anger or aggression. Like what drew you to that topic?
Yeah, I will say some of my favorite kids to work with over the years have been the kids that are labeled angry. So one of the reasons I love working with kids who are quote unquote angry, by the way, I don't love labeling kids as angry, but we're going to just say angry kids for the podcast just because it's easier.
Yeah, I would always say that every time we say angry kid, angry is in quotation marks.
Yeah, so just picture angry in quotation marks because we're never going to come out and be like, that's just an angry child. And that's why I like working with angry kids so much, why I'm drawn to working with angry kids, because I think that angry kids are some of the most misunderstood kids out there. Angry kids often are labeled as angry, strong-willed. They're said that they're stubborn. Maybe I've heard even recently someone was telling me about their own angry kid and they're saying, oh yeah, they were born with like a chip on their shoulder. And I often think from early ages when these kids have more tantrums, more counter will at a young age, like they're stubborn, they're strong-willed, and they get this label really early on and it just sticks with them. And in my work with angry kids, what my entire job is to see why. Why are they angry, right? And so parents come in or teachers come in with, this kid is really angry. How do I punish them? That's what they used to say, you know.
Yeah, I think some people would still say the same thing.
Some people will still say that. I mean, I get that less now because they know that I'm not going to tell them how to punish them. Now the question has kind of changed more to, how can I understand them, which I love. That's great. Love that we're making some progress. But the question used to always be, Jess, I have a really angry kid. All the discipline I'm doing isn't working. How do I go about punishing them because they can't keep being this angry, right? So my job is to come in and get curious and try and understand, why are they so angry?
So you've had like families come in and say those words to you, like how can we punish them or discipline them or whatever?
So many. I'm thinking about even the 16-year-old girl that I was working with one time who was quote unquote angry. And the parents literally came in to me, sat down, I so clearly remember this, in the chairs in my office and said, look, when she was younger and she would be angry with us, we would just take away things that she didn't want. or that she wanted. So
Yeah.
we would take away her iPad. We would take away, you can't go to your friend's house tonight. We'd take away privileges. But now we've been doing this forever, ever since she was little. And she would just get more angry, but she'd just go to her room and kind of sulk about it. And now she's 16 and we took away the iPad last week. She went in our room, destroyed our entire room, found the iPad and used it anyway. We tell her to go sit in her room for timeout because she's being disrespectful to us. She refuses. And it's not like we can carry her and put her in the room and close the door anymore.
Right.
Right. So yes, and they're like, so we're out of ideas. Like how else do we punish this? And those are the kind of cases that I love to get because there's just so much room for change. And that's the case of a 16-year-old girl. But I will say in our practice, we're seeing a lot of anger, specifically in boys. Anger seems to be a little bit more of an acceptable emotion for them. We do see it in girls, but sometimes with girls, it's coming out more in anxiety. But we're seeing a lot of boys in our practice, 6 to 13-ish, struggling a lot with anger. That's a theme that we've just been having lately. And so we're always really excited to get those referrals in because we know with anger, we can work with something. The emotion is there. The feelings are there. We just kind of have to understand why and how it's serving them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I will say I love angry kids and I'm really excited that we can dive into a little bit today.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about angry children that are maybe still prevalent and that you wish people would understand, understood differently?
A few things. I think a huge misconception for angry children is that it's the child's fault that they're angry and that there's something the child needs to do in order to stop being so angry.
What's the alternative, though? Is it that it's the parents' fault?
Not necessarily. It could be anything. We don't know why the child's angry, right? So our posture has to be curiosity. It's not necessarily the parents' fault. Like I was seeing a child who was angry. Recently, we were seeing someone in our practice and the child was apparently angry and not listening and stubborn and defiant, and we don't know why, and the parents are fantastic and it's really confusing. Well, we get curious and realize that this boy is getting bullied, right? And the parents had no idea, the teacher had no idea it was going on behind everyone's back. And it was coming out at home in anger, right? So that's not the parents' fault, but sometimes we have to really dig deep to figure out what's going on. So that's one thing I wish that people knew is that an angry child doesn't want to be an angry child. And I think we need to change the way that we see children. And I think this is Russ Green, I think is his name. He's a child psychologist, and he coined the phrase, kids do well when they can. And I've always loved that phrase. Like our kids want to do well, they desire to do well. And if they're not doing well, there's something in their environment that needs to be changed, or there's something going on personally for them. So if we look at our kids and we have a interpretation of their behavior that's a little bit more compassionate to them, right? Just assuming the best of them instead of assuming the worst of our angry kids, I think that in itself helps us deal with our angry kids in a different way.
Right.
So that would be the first thing I wish people would understand. The second thing I wish people would understand is that if all you do is tell your angry kids to start taking some deep breaths, it's not going to work, right? Like this is deeper, I think. And I give coping tools like that too, right? We need some coping tools to learn how to be angry, but deep breaths, whatever it is, calming corners is not going to be necessarily enough to solve your child's anger. And a lot of people are like, they won't take a deep breath. It's like, okay. So that's fine. Just scratch that. Like that doesn't matter that much. Let's figure out the root cause. So that's really what's more important to me. And then the third thing I want people to understand.
How many things do you want them to know?
It's the third thing. It's the last thing. Is that anger is often a cover for sadness. Did you see this coming?
Yes, I have a comment, but you keep going, please.
A lot of times in the kids that I have worked with, anger is there to protect them. It's a defense, right? If I'm angry and I yell and I get mad and I protect myself as much as I can, then I can be safe from feeling how sad I really am. And I think a lot of the times with our angry kids, they don't have places to be sad that feel safe. So a lot of the work that we do in therapy is so let's say a child who's being bullied, right? If they don't have a place where they can feel sad about the fact that they're being bullied and the words that has been told to them, and they're carrying that sadness like deep down within themselves, the anger makes sense as a way to continue to protect themselves from the words that someone is saying, right? So a lot of times, and that's not the whole answer, but a lot of the times our angry kids don't have places to be sad and release their tears and feel like they can calm themselves that way. So the anger continues to build. But the anger tells us that there is emotion there, and so that's good. I'd rather an angry kid than a kid who has no emotion. That's harder to come back from.
Apathy is maybe worse.
Apathy is harder to come back from. If your kid is angry, I always say to parents, we have a lot we can work with. There's emotion there. We have to kind of figure out how we're going to support them. But if we have an apathetic kid who has no emotion left and of like a really flat affect, that's a little bit harder.
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I feel like I don't 100% agree. And maybe this is unfounded, so it's more my own way of thinking about this. But to me, it doesn't really make sense that anger is often covering sadness.
Okay.
To me, what would make more sense is saying that anger is often a cover for uncomfortable stimuli or like feeling uncomfortable emotionally. So it's your way of, I don't know, maybe the brain's way of getting this uncomfortable thing away from you or out of you. So I feel like saying it's just sadness, I have a hard time seeing how that is the case all the time.
Right. It might not be the case all the time. Like sometimes anger is there because we simply need it, right? Or something makes us angry in a very valid way, right? Anger is not necessarily always wrong, but I think when we're dealing with angry kids who are constantly angry all the time, that's where I start to look at it a little bit different. And I start to wonder, how is anger serving them? And where is it maybe being a defense mechanism?
Yeah. Yeah, so I wouldn't say I disagree with it being a defense mechanism. Mm-hmm. I feel like it, in my mind, I have a hard time seeing how anger is mostly covering up for sadness if it's not just anger in itself. Mm-hmm. Right? Like it just, to me, it seems like it's your brain's response to something that is uncomfortable for you, whether it's sadness or anxiety or whatever, something else. It's a way of getting that feeling out. Mm-hmm. So whatever, that may be completely incorrect, but that's just the way I think about it. It's hard for me to see that that's just sadness,
that's at the root cause of all anger.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be, but also sometimes it can be, I'm fearful of the situation I'm in and I'm backed against into a corner here and I have to lash out, like that kind of thing, right?
So I think what we can actually kind of reframe anger in our mind a little bit as alarm. I think that's kind of what you're talking about, right? When our system is alarmed because something's going on, whether you're anxious at the root of it or you're sad at the root of it. But anger often is like these alarm bells are going off in our body and it's a call to feel like we have to do something about it, right? Yeah. And that feeling of anger and the action, the behaviors that often come with anger are two separate things, right? But I think what you're describing is the alarm system in the body kind of going off and being like, I need to respond, I need to do something about this. It's more of like an active feeling in the body, and I think that's very accurate.
Yeah, like I know what the feeling of anger in my body is.
Yeah.
And sometimes maybe it is kind of covering or coming out because of the sadness that I'm feeling of a certain situation, which has definitely happened. We know that. But then I think also other times it's, I don't know, like I'm annoyed by a situation occurring and I just feel the anger, or it's just uncomfort, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I could probably get super deep into that, but then people might be feeling like it's a bit overanalyzing it a little bit, right? But let's say you're annoyed by a situation that's happening, and like give me an example of a time you've been angry and annoyed.
I mean, it's usually I'm in the middle of like fixing something in the house, and then one or multiple of the girls need me, or they all are making a big mess and spilling things and I have to clean it up, and it's stopping me from finishing the thing that I'm working on.
Right. So you're feeling frustrated, you're feeling annoyed because you can't do the thing that you wanted to do. And I could be totally wrong here. And then at a deeper level, it's like, well, I really wanted to do this thing today. I was really hoping to get it done. That's really important to me. Nobody in this house sees how important this is to me. So I'm feeling unseen. I'm feeling unheard. And like, at least that's kind of what goes on for me, right? So at an even deeper level, like, yes, it's frustrating and they're annoying you. It makes sense. But at a deeper level, you're not getting the thing done that you wanted to do, and that's making you feel unseen or unheard, or like you can't do the thing you wanted to do, and maybe there's some sadness around not being able to get the thing done that you wanted to do.
I feel like that's a bit of a stretch, or you're like very loosely defining sadness then. Like, I think maybe your default is feeling sad
Right.
about things. And again, we could get into like how society has like basically gendered certain emotions too. And so maybe it's just because I grew up and that was, like we've talked about, the only acceptable emotion for me to have was anger. Then maybe that's just like it wired my brain to feel that way.
And I think your temperament aligns a little bit more with the temperament of someone who is a little bit more easy to anger. Or
I think it's probably, and I got into this in the research that I looked into, there is evidence to suggest that it's both genetic and environmental anger. So it can be passed down, which I think it was in my family. And also it compounds on itself when you have an environment where parents are more angry, and it just kind of creates this cycle of creating more angry.
Yeah. And I think for you, you're a very self-aware person. And I think at this point in your life, you're not super easy to anger. So it's a little bit different. But why I'm trying to kind of push on this point of sadness is I think a lot of even parents define themselves like, I'm just an angry parent. I'm easy to anger. I'm a yeller. You know, my parents were yellers. I'm a yeller. And I think in those situations where anger is your default and you just see yourself as an angry person, to me, almost always in therapy, when we have either kids or adults who see themselves as angry people, there is a sadness that is being defended, like that the alarm system of your body is defending you against. And that's just almost always the case when I see this like consistent anger, not just like the one time my kids, you know.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So that's why I'm trying to just push on that
it's more
a little
if it's
bit.
like a chronic type of
It's
anger.
a chronic anger. Your alarm system is chronically on. What's the deeper reason? And often there are some tears and some safety that have to come out.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that.
So yeah, I guess maybe that's the difference. Talking about like a one-off versus like anger as like your identity and who you are.
Yeah, I would almost define that as a chronic anger then.
Right. And so like I haven't even think about your childhood, right? You're saying like how anger was the default and everybody was angry and your family was angry. And you and I have talked about this before, right? You're all seen as like this angry, like a lot of anger.
People describe my family as either angry or incredibly passionate.
Right.
That's a nice way to say it, I think.
Yeah, at the time. But what do we actually know, right? Is that was probably the alarm system always being activated because of all of this underlying trauma that everybody was going through.
Yep, for sure.
So anyway, rant over.
Okay. I'm on the same page with you now. I wasn't convinced at first, but I think we just needed to define a few things.
Yeah, that's perfect. This is why we have you, right? We got to have the skeptic.
Okay, let's get back on topic here. In your practice, or I guess in situations that you've seen, how would you differentiate between what might be a typical toddler tantrum or like angry outburst of even our 7, almost 8-year-old versus something that's more deep rooted and like needs to be handled emotionally.
So I would ask myself and my clients, like toddler tantrums, again, let's look at child development, developmentally appropriate. I saw someone on a Facebook thread that I was on just freaking out because her toddler has like 5 tantrums a day. And I think I even commented back like, hey, developmentally appropriate. Let's not get too worried about that. So we're expecting toddlers to get angry about little things. The sun is shining, it's a perfect day, and they're pissed off at you. Normal. What the difference is if they're never getting back to like a baseline. Like we're not like a baseline of like happy or joy or other emotions. Like we're
Some kind of contentment.
Some kind of contentment. Yep. Like we should see our toddlers have these huge explosive meltdowns and then ideally come down from that, let out those tears, and then they're running and giggling and playing again a little bit later, right? So they're coming back to that contentment. Yep. If we're not seeing that, that's where I would get concerned. Like it shouldn't just be all day long tantrums. Yep. And then as we approach the older ages, if you're seeing a lot of power struggles, stubbornness, if you're defining your child as strong-willed, if everything feels like a battle, that's again where I'd be like, okay, not everything should feel like a battle. There
should be times where it's easier.
Yeah, there should be times when there's easier. It should be a trying stage. Like,
Yeah, for sure.
2 to 7 is trying. It shouldn't be easy for you as a parent, but it shouldn't be constant.
In the research that I was reading, there were some large studies that have been done on that. And what they found was that anger peaks in toddlerhood, obviously. So 2 to 3 years old. And it's when language and self-control skills are really just starting to become more developed. So they were saying it peaks at that time, and then it progressively should get better and better over time. But it's just a normal stage of development. And they found this in wide-ranging, like very large studies.
Yeah, it's just important to note that your kids are born with all of the emotions that they're ever going to have. It's all in them.
Yeah.
But no tools, no way to handle it. So it's just a lot. And that comes out in the toddler years.
There were some studies that I read on infancy. So they did on infants, and they were finding around the age of 4 months that they could see that the emotion of anger coming out. So it's something that humans are obviously born with. There's a component of genetics that are a part of it, but we're innately able to express some of these emotions. And in that study in particular, they could block a specific goal from happening for the baby and see that they were getting frustrated and angry, which I found that's very cute. Quite interesting.
And yeah, so I think that's important to know as we have these discussions on anger, that anger is an important emotion. There's nothing wrong. Yeah. We're born with it. It's part of who we are. And it's just what we're talking about here is when it becomes a problem, is when it's all the time.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. So I've been mentioning that I was reading a bunch of studies on genetics versus environment. From your professional perspective, what do you think shapes a child's tendency towards anger and aggression more?
I think it's a mix. There's definitely both. So we have children who are born with a more active temperament. That's what it's called in the research. And this temperament from early on, you will see that these children are a little bit more prone to anger. They have a higher sense of justice. They might appear a little bit more strong-willed. They might be more highly sensitive to things in their environment. And from the get-go, you might notice that these children have bigger emotions. And we saw that firsthand, I think, with our own daughter who was born with that temperament.
Yep.
From infancy.
She was able to roll over within 2 weeks. I think we have a video of her 2 weeks old, and she was rolling from her back to her front to back already. Like, she's very active.
And as a baby, she was loud.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
she was so loud.
Pterodactyl screeching.
All the time. And as a toddler, her tantrums we had already had a child at this point. We thought we had dealt with tantrums, but her tantrums were next level.
Yep.
And so I think that's not anything we did different between the two kids. One kid was born with this temperament, the other two were not. Right. So I think it's really important that we bring that up, because sometimes parents are like, what did I do to make them this way? It's like, it's possible you didn't do anything. This is just how they're born.
It's just genetic trait that was passed on.
But what can happen, and what I've seen happen so many times in my clinical work, is that someone who is born with that trait, a little bit more of a tendency towards, let's say, those big, big, deep emotions, has a parent who doesn't know how to deal with that, right? Which is most of us. And let me us tell you, like, even when we were dealing with that, it was a lot. And we had to be very mindful of the way we approached that child. And a parent who doesn't know how to deal with it, a parent who gets triggered by anger, a parent who maybe was yelled at themselves. And so sometimes the parenting can really continue to fuel the anger, and it doesn't go away, it gets worse, right? So, and I'm not saying this to shame parents, but if you have that highly sensitive or that active temperament child, and you start to yell at them when they're yelling at you, if you start to punish them, if you send them away from you when they're having those kind of big emotions, if you try and shut down their anger at all costs, if you don't let them have their tears, all of these different things can lead to more built up anger, more built up resentment, and they might not be able to develop in, like you were saying, after kind of that 3-year-old stage, like usually between 5 to 7, we start seeing, okay, they have some tools to regulate themselves now. But if they haven't learned how to regulate themselves in those early toddler years, 5 to 7 is usually when we see the huge explosions. And then like 7 to 13 is when they're coming to me. Because by that time, we should start to see some development of coping tools, which comes from how we teach them.
Yeah, and the research definitely agrees with what you're saying there. It was interesting because they did a bunch of twin studies. And I mean, they can't, it would not be ethical for them to say one twin you have to spank and the other one you do. But they did find that, I think it was close to 1,800. I'm pretty sure that was the study where they had close to 1,800 twins. And just inevitably, a lot of them were parented differently. Like the twins, even identical twins, were treated differently. And they saw fewer aggressive, angry types of behaviors from the children that were, let's say, parented a little bit more gently.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That suggests that it's more environmental, but there are also studies in it. They explain that children, let's say, likely myself, I'd be interested to take like a genetic study of some kind, but there are certain genes that predispose people to being a little bit more angry, or sets of genes, I guess. And if that child is born into a family with parenting that's done more harshly or in more angry or aggressive manners, they will likely be angry and aggressive later in life. They're predisposed to it, and then also their environment kind of amplifies it.
Exactly.
But the children that were followed who were predisposed to it but had gentler, loving, like within, of course, the boundaries of like an authoritative parent, like we've talked about, they were far more likely to be calmer and get angry far less often. Like basically your genetics play a part, but in their environment that they grow up in is really what makes the difference.
Yes.
But if they have both the genes to be more angry and they're in a harsher environment, they are like many multiples times more likely to be angry themselves.
And I think that's incredibly important research for us to remember.
Yeah.
Because I will say the other thing I love, or I'm passionate about for angry kids, is angry kids get the most punishment.
Yep.
And angry kids
I got it all the time.
Need it the least.
Oh, we've been talking about intergenerational, I guess, anger. And I mean, you can see it in my family. I think it's pretty plainly obvious. So in a situation like mine, let's say, where it's very clear. Like, I know my great-grandfather, the stories I hear about him, incredibly angry person. My grandfather, I know, had that side to him. My dad, same thing. Me, especially when I was younger, did. And now it's like only certain situations it will come out of me. But for the most part, I feel like it's kind of, I'm a pretty calm individual at this point. But how does one break out of those intergenerational, I guess, challenges that we have? Like, it's obviously genetic, or maybe it's not obviously genetic, but it is very likely a mixture of genetic and environmental for me. So how, if maybe I was someone who was constantly angry, how could I work through that?
Well, you did.
Yeah, I know I did, but
Yeah. So I'm like, I'll give you some suggestions, but I think people would love to hear from you too. Cause I'm assuming there'll probably be lots of dads listening to this. Like, yeah, that's me too, Scott. Like, my dad was angry. His dad was angry. Their dad was angry. You know, I think in a lot of men, we see this, and then their son becomes angry and they're like, I don't know how to deal with this. Right. And I think the first thing is there a desire there to not be that way? I think if there's a desire to not be angry, then we can work with that. I think in a lot of parents who are struggling with anger, if they don't have the desire to do things different, like I've seen that in some of the parents that I've worked with, right? Like, let's say the female partner wants to do things different, but the male partner's like, well, my dad yelled at me and, you know, this was,
I turned out fine.
I turned out fine. And there's not a desire to do something different. That's harder to work with. But if you're coming to me and you're like, I'm yelling at my kids all the time and I don't want to, and my dad yelled at me and I didn't like it, that's best case scenario. So first of all, that's great if you're listening to this and you have a desire to do something different. There's so many ways we can go about healing it. I think one of the things is, like, we do need to remember what it was like to be a child and to truly look critically at our experiences as a child. I think a lot of times, like you said, people will be like, well, I was yelled at as a kid and I turned out fine.
Yeah, I didn't like it at the time, but I've
I
turned
needed
out
it.
fine. Yeah,
I deserved it.
Yep.
You know, I was a bratty kid. And so a lot of the work that I have to do then is like, okay, but let's really look into what was going on for you as a kid, right? And I tell this story, I've told this on Nurture First a few times, of this person I was talking to said, well, I was spanked as a child and, you know, I think I needed it because I was bad. And then I said, okay, well, give me an example. What was a time that you were spanked? And then he said something about, well, my sister knocked over my Lego tower and so I hit her. And my parents had told me to stop hitting my sister. Like, okay, so then what happened, right? And we went through all these steps and, okay, well, my mom said that when dad gets home, he's going to spank me. And so I was so afraid of my dad. And my dad got home, he spanked me. Okay, and what did you learn? Did you learn not to hit your sister? Well, no, I mean, I still hit her, but I knew that if dad was going to be around, that I shouldn't do that because dad was going to be there. I was terrified of my dad.
Yep.
Right? And so what did you do the next time your sister did something and you didn't like it? Well, I'd yell at her, I'd kick her, I'd take her stuff from her room and like all these different things. So there was no lesson that was being learned, right? But unless we get curious about our experiences, we might just think, oh, well, I deserved it because I was bad. And a lot of, I would say, these men specifically, not to pick on men, but it just seems to be more common, they have a deep, deep internalized view that they are a bad person. And that comes out in their parenting too, right? It started when they were a kid. Well, I was bad, so this, you know. And then now they're saying that their own child is bad. But really what they're actually saying is like, I was bad. I'm still bad. And so my kid must be bad for doing this too. So a lot of the work is much deeper than like a specific strategy. It's changing the way that you view yourself and changing the way that you view your child. Because I think when we start to view our children as good and having a hard time, like good kids that are having a hard time that need our help, the way we respond to them completely changes. But if I view my child as a bad kid who needs to learn a lesson, I'm going to respond to them totally different. So a lot of it is mindset and the way we see kids as a starting point. And I think that was big for you too.
Yeah, for sure. It's quite possible that it would be different for me. I don't know. Like it's a different life, right?
You never know. Yeah.
But me having a son, I don't know if it would change the way I act or the way I do things or the way I interact with a son versus having 3 daughters.
I think it'd be very healing for you if you had had a
Yeah,
son.
probably.
Yeah. But
Now, can you convince me then I'm playing devil's advocate here. I am skeptical of this idea of not following the same path because, again, I feel like I turned out just fine. And if I have a son or daughter that is not angry or aggressive, they're going to be weak. And being angry or aggressive means that they're going to get things done and they're going to be successful and they're going to be strong. And you see that in the world, right? Like a lot of the most popular leaders are just angry people and not necessarily, they're not like the kindest individuals, and people would not, I don't know. It would be refreshing, but I feel like people would think that someone who's not angry about things that are happening, people would find that kind of leader weak.
yeah. And you're worried in this skeptical question that you're asking me. You're worried about raising a soft child.
Yeah.
Like a snowflake.
Yeah, I mean that's the term that people use, right? Especially on YouTube.
Our YouTube followers. No, they're not our followers. But yes. Yes, you're worried about raising a snowflake. That makes total sense because you don't want to raise a kid who crumples at the first sign of someone saying something not very nice to them and they go cry in their room for the rest of the day, right?
And I think historically anger and aggression has been seen as a strong emotion, right? It's the manly thing to do.
Of course. And so if you're raising your kid and you're trying to help them with their anger, are they no longer going to have that grit and that ability to be strong in the world? I think that's a valid question. And I actually think it's a really important question because I do think that we have a bit of an issue right now where a lot of people are leaning away from the harsh parenting, as we should, but we're all almost going a little bit too far to the passive side. And we're not allowing our children to experience any hardships, right? Or we're trying to take away all the pain that they have. And it can lead our kids to not have the ability to cope with the troubles that will come up in the world. So I actually think in your skeptical scenario, you are hitting on an important point, which is when we're teaching our children how to cope with anger and how to cope with aggression and the feelings in their body, we don't want to do that by taking away the things that make them feel angry and like bubble wrapping them essentially, right? That's not going to help them because in the real world, hard things happen all the time. So our job is not to take away all the things that make them angry and upset and kind of bubble wrap them, but is to teach them resilience and help them continue to have that grit, but we're going to teach it to them in a different way than you learned it when you were a kid. So for example, a lot of times people will say, in the real world, if you show up late or you have an issue with your boss, you can't just yell at your boss. We can't just like teach our kids that it's okay to yell at their bosses or whatever. I'm like, yeah, you're totally right. Like if you're angry at a job, you can't just yell at your boss. Your kids can't learn that, right? So that's why we want to teach our kids early on how to deal with conflict in a healthy way, how to communicate what they're feeling.
Right.
So I think the balance here in your question is, yes, we want to teach our kids how to cope with disappointment, how to be resilient, and how to still have some of that grit while helping them cope with their anger in healthy and effective ways. And I think when we can do that, we can raise very powerful and strong kids.
Why?
Because let's say, for example, we have a kid and we've been talking about the genetic and like the nature versus the nurture, right? So you have a child who's, let's say, very sensitive to lights, textures, overstimulated very quickly, and that ends up coming out in anger. But in reality, I would say a lot of angry kids are actually highly sensitive and don't know how to cope with it. So if we could give our sensitive kids tools early on to be like, you're going to be sensitive in the world, and the world is going to be loud. There's going to be lots of things going on, but here's some ways that you can cope with that so that you don't get to the point where you're screaming and yelling when you're at school, right? So we give them some tools to cope with it. At the very same time, we don't say, because you're so sensitive, I'm no longer going to send you to school, right? That's too much for you. It's too overwhelming. You shouldn't have to go to school and be in such a place that's going to be too overstimulating. So at the same time, we're still sending them.
Yep.
And we're giving them tools to cope with it. And so now you have a child who learns, I can do a hard thing, like go to school where it's overstimulating and there's a lot going on, and I can have tools to cope with the hard thing, and I can have someone to talk to when that hard thing is really hard, and I have a safe place to land. And I think when you have that combination, that's how you can raise children who are truly resilient and who someday when they're adults and they're in the workforce, they're going to know how to cope with, like, let's say their day at work is really overstimulating, but they're going to actually have tools to know what to do so that they're not just flying off the handle at every person that comes their way.
Right. Well, even outside of work too, right?
Yeah,
relationships and every relationship that they deal with and every situation they deal with.
Yeah, like even in relationships, right? If our highly sensitive daughter who's more prone to anger, one of the things she likes to do is when she's really angry, she'll just run away from us and like try and hide.
Yep.
It's a way for her to kind of protect herself because she's deeply vulnerable in those moments, and those are the hardest ones for her. And so if we just let her be like, oh, it's too much. This conversation's too hard for her. We can't hold her responsible for her actions. And she just, every time we just let her run away and like, you know what, it's fine. I'll just clean up her mess or whatever. That's not giving her the skills to learn how to deal with conflict in the real world, right? But when we can actually follow her, have a conversation, continue to hold our boundary, and teach her that she can actually deal with having these hard emotions. And it doesn't mean we're going to yell at her every single time, but she can have a difficult conversation. Eventually in friendships and relationships, she's going to learn how to have those difficult conversations and that it's okay and it's safe. But if we never do that, we never follow through with that, never hold our boundaries, never follow through with these discussions, eventually in relationships, she's just going to run away. Like she's going to know, well, even my parents couldn't handle my big feelings. So
yeah, right.
How could a partner? So I think the question you asked is the question everybody's asking right now. And there's a huge difference between being passive and permissive and thinking my child's too sensitive to handle the world and bubble wrapping them, and raising a child that can be resilient because we've given them the tools to do so.
Yeah, and the reality is it will be more challenging as parents for certain kids. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make them worse. It's just
we just have to have a different tools for these kids, and that's what we're trying to talk about today. And that's like, not to pitch our anger course, but that's like what that course is all
that's
about,
not
right?
launched yet.
When this episode launches, will it be launched?
I don't know.
Okay. Maybe. I mean, if our anger course is launched, we'll have it linked. If not, exciting news. It's coming out soon. But we've been working on this course, and it's specifically for these tools for these kids who have these different needs.
And I will say for myself, and maybe I'm biased, I'm highly sensitive for sure. But I notice so many things that you'd never notice. Mm-hmm. Right. And I feel like there are definitely benefits for me being that highly sensitive, mm-hmm. maybe more historically more prone to being angry. Mm-hmm. There are benefits to the traits that I have.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah. Like, let's not, there's so many good things to having that trait too. And like the natural, like we're kind of talking about resilience, like the natural kind of oomph that these kids have, I think they can be the most incredible leaders. Like they can do such incredible things. And just think, like you said, a lot of great leaders or like leaders of huge companies, not great necessarily.
I never said great. I just said
they get there because of their anger.
Yes.
But I personally think there is also leaders that can do really well because they have the skills to navigate people, and they have the skills to deal with their own anger. And those are the people that are highly respected. And I want our kids to grow up as people who are respect others and respected for the way that they behave and they act.
You say that, I don't know that the world necessarily agrees
well, maybe
with that
who I
sentiment,
respect.
But yeah,
maybe
who
I
we respect, yes, but I don't actually think.
I have a small amount of people that I would put in that category.
Yeah. Let's get into more practical stuff. So
okay.
When we're going to use you as an example first because you are the child therapist. You know how to do this well. When you first meet a child who has been labeled angry, how do you approach building trust and getting them to open up about what they're feeling?
First thing I do is just try and find out what they're interested in, right? So depending on their age, what do you like? I've worked with a lot of angry boys and they often like chess or...
Multiple?
Oh yeah, I've worked with a lot of like boys who like to play chess. Chess works, whatever they like to do. So that's the first thing I do as a therapist is what do you like to do? Let's do it together.
It's like different games. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It's often going to be far too vulnerable and never on the first session would I look at them and be like, what's going on? Why are you so angry? I got to build a trust. You have to build rapport. And as parents, a lot of the time with the anger that's going on, you may have lost the rapport. So you got to do the same thing. You got to try and build the relationship back because your child's only going to be truly open with you once you have that foundation set. So I think we always got to go back to the basics of building the relationship, whether you're a child therapist or you're the parent in this situation or the teacher, it doesn't matter. So that's the first thing.
You start with building that rapport. So doing things that they like or finding something that's in common between you.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah. So we start with that. We do that for a while first. Typically, my line of questioning is never so direct with a child, right? Never, why are you angry? Because they're not going to necessarily tell me unless I have a very highly self-aware child who wants to talk about it. It's right there on the tip of their tongue. But typically, we got to do a little bit more beating around the bush type of work first. So, okay, tell me about school. And then child tells you about school. Tell me about home. If I'm in therapy, we're probably drawing out people who make them feel safe in their life. And over time, so if they tell me about school, I try and notice when children give me answers that I feel are incomplete. Our own kids do this too, right? How was school? Oh, it was okay. All right, so we have okay. That feels incomplete to me. So then I'll ask about the okay. And then I'll get something, oh yeah, well, so-and-so were playing snow angels on the hill today. Oh, okay. So tell me more about that. And your best phrase for your angry child is going to be, tell me more. You're just going to kind of keep getting them to tell you more, tell me more, and keep digging because your angry child's it's not going to be the first thing that they say that's the problem. But then outside of that, you might not even get an answer specifically from your child. A lot of people are like, I got curious, I got nothing. Then your job is kind of survey the rest of their life, right? And start to notice a pattern. When is the anger happening? Maybe it's always after school. Maybe it's always in the morning. Are you seeing any patterns? Start to kind of keep an eye on that. And then also I would start to wonder if there's any sensitivities. Like, is it when they're overwhelmed? Is it when they had a busy day? Is it during transitions? Like, when are you seeing the majority of the anger? Does it happen at school? Does it only happen at home? So a lot of the getting curious is actually in your own head, not necessarily asking your kid, especially when they're younger. And that's your job. And just start to observe and notice and realize that a child doesn't go from being content to being pissed off. Like there's things that are happening in between. And so our job is to try and just be this scientist and try and just understand. You can even write it in your notebook. Try and take some notes. That will help you get curious. I'll say another thing that you could do is if the relationship is there between you and your child and you're like, I feel close to them, I just don't get it, what's going on for them lately. I would, let's say they storm off and they're in their bedroom. I just wrote a post on this, so I just had this top of mind. They storm off and they're in their bedroom. I'd maybe grab a tea or a hot chocolate, something that they like. I'd probably head over to their bedroom and sit on their bed with them and sit beside them and be like, hey, you know what I've been noticing lately? It's every time I ask you to do your homework, you're mad. You slam the door, you walk away. And look, I'm on your team. So let's try and get curious about this together. What's up? And just trying to partner, especially with your older kids in that way, is going to get you really far.
Yep.
Because now they know you're on your team versus you're just yelling at them to do their homework.
Now, can you clarify something for me? Yeah. Let's see, you were talking at the beginning about finding something that in common, playing a game with them. Should you be going through this line of questioning at some point? not interrogating, but
Yeah.
like just kind of bringing things up casually while you're doing that with them. So if I'm playing a board game with the girls, I could be asking our oldest about school and friends and all that kind of stuff, and any issues that.
It's a great time because you're a little distracted.
Yeah.
I find I get the best answers from kids when they're also doing something else, right? Because how intense is it to look into the eyes of your parent and be like, well, actually, but if your eyes can be averted and you're working on something else, or you're driving is a great time. They're in the back, you're in the front. It's not like you have to make this direct eye contact. Lots of opportunities like that to have those deeper conversations.
Now, can I bring up, let's say, a specific example of a child who comes home from school, maybe is 4 years old, is in junior kindergarten or preschool. They're perfectly fine at school all day long. But then as soon as they get home, they turn into almost a different kid, and they start hitting their sibling because their sibling took a toy or something, or has a toy that they want desperately, and just acts totally different as soon as they're home. What reason might there be for that?
There's a few reasons. One, let's say you have a sensitive kid and they've had all of these things happen all day, light, sounds, taste, textures. By the time they get home, they're probably super hungry. They haven't had their after school snack yet. And it's just the perfect storm. They're just tired enough. So the sensory storm, I think that can happen when a child gets home. And then all of a sudden it's chaos because you're coming home from school and it's all busy. And then your parent just asks you just one more thing. And it's like the last thing. Like if you think of like you have like this bucket that you're drawing from, like it's the last thing, the last drop, and you just lose it. So I think that's really common. And it just shows that a lot of times our young children's school days are not set up for sensory success for these kids. Another thing is a child may have not felt safe all day to cry about the things that are going on. And one thing we know about kids is that, especially these kids under the age of 7, they need to have tears, and often. I always say that on Nurture First. It's like they have to cry. And so if a child hasn't cried all day long, there's a lot of pent-up tears. And it's probably because they stubbed their toe, and then their tummy hurt, and then so-and-so said a mean name to them, and then they didn't get to be first in line. And it's just all these little things that if they were home, they would have quickly cried about that for a second and then moved on. But they haven't cried about it all day. So then they see you're their safe person. It's like, oh, great, perfect. And then without even
Just release it all.
thinking, they cry it all out. And maybe it's that they're yelling at you and they're getting mad, but actually they're feeling safe with you and they had to let those tears out. So that's the second reason. And the third kind of matches with that. But as kids get a little bit older, especially in our kids who maybe end up getting diagnosed someday with like ADHD or like some other neurodiversities, they can often kind of hide their emotions really well. We call it masking. So they can mask their emotions all day long.
Yep.
And they can appear very, very high functioning, and they can appear that they understand what's going on at school and that they get it all, but maybe they're not actually getting it all. And then when they get home again, it's just like a release of all the emotions that they've been having to hold together all day long. So I do see that a lot.
So what would you do in those? Do you handle those situations differently then?
Yes. I mean,
Like
I
if
feel
you
like
know
we could
it's
do
a
a
sensory related thing, like they're just overstimulated from the day,
Yeah.
then you try and create a calming environment for them when they get home.
I'll give you one suggestion for each, but folks can let us know because I could do a whole podcast episode on each.
I mean,
of
this
those.
is the course too. It covers all of this.
Or
in
just take the
depth too,
course.
right? So,
Yeah, honestly, the course is really good. I'm super happy with how it came out. But yeah, let's just give one example for the sensory thing. What I did do and have done and will continue to do is our daughter who's like that. Like when we get home, we're not going to put 100 demands on her,
yep.
right? She knows where her backpacks and stuff goes. She puts that away. The snack is there. It's ready to go. And we're not going to have a whole bunch of conversation with her while she eats that snack. She has her snack. She has quiet time. It's not the time to be like, how was your day? And how was so-and-so? And was your teacher night? Like, no questioning. It's too much.
Yep.
And then only once she's had her snack and her quiet time and time to decompress, then we talk to her about her day. It's just a simple change and it helps a lot.
Nice. Okay, second one.
Needing to feel safe with you. These kids,
Lots of hugs.
yeah, you might, especially kids who struggle with that separation. The second I would see them, I would have a big smile on my face. I would be very intentional to not be on my phone or distracted. My arms would be open for a hug. And I would say, I've been thinking about you today. I couldn't wait to pick you up.
Yep.
And I would anticipate that there's going to be tears. And I would be totally fine with that. I'd be like, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I'm so glad you feel like you can cry with me. And I would let them have their tears, knowing that as soon as the tears are fully out, like we just let them come all the way out, they can move on with their night. And we see that all the time, like in our practice and with our own kids.
Yep.
Once the tears are out, we can move on. So don't fear them. Just welcome them in and know that that has to happen in order for your child to move on with their night. And the third one, the masking one, you would start to notice that if you're seeing at home, like your child's having a lot of difficulty with school, maybe like certain subjects at school are really hard, and those are the kids who are more likely even to like start refusing to go to school because they feel like they have to put on this like certain show at school, but they can't actually do it. Mm-hmm. So in those cases, they're a little more complex. I'd be talking with the teacher, maybe getting them some support, maybe talking to a doctor, especially if you're like thinking your child might have some like learning disabilities or like neurodiversity, something going on. Sometimes that can come out in anger when in reality, the child's just feeling like they're not smart, they're not as good as their peers, and they need some extra support. So that I would definitely be talking to a professional about that.
Okay. Very good. We have very little time left here, so let's get through the last few questions quickly.
Rapid fire.
Where does discipline fit into the picture here? Like, how can parents set firm boundaries while not adding fuel to the anger fire that is within some of their children?
I feel like that's a whole podcast episode.
I mean, each of these we could probably break out into that, but
yeah, I don't know how I'm going to rapid fire answer that. Know that boundaries are important. Know that your child needs to know what they are ahead of time as often as you can. Remember, I think I sang this once. I won't sing it again on the podcast, but kids like to be told. Mr. Rogers.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, they like to be told what they have to do when they're doing something new, what's going on. Tell your kids the plan. If there's rules that they're always pushing against, ask yourself why. Remember, children want to do well, and they do well when they can. So why is your child, ask yourself, is my boundary appropriate? Is it realistic? Like sometimes I think parents get the most angry at children for their own unrealistic expectation of their child. So I guess I would throw it back to the parent and ask yourself, is this realistic? If you don't know, then maybe you have to do a little bit more research, and we have tons of episodes and courses and all that on what is actually a realistic expectation of your child. And if it is realistic, talk to your child about it in a calm moment and be like, hey, this is our rule. This is our expectation. How can I help you meet that?
Sounds good. Next question. Do you teach children specific techniques or exercises to manage their anger? And what does that look like in practice?
Like in my therapy practice?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I do. So again, calming tools, I mean, blah, blah, blah. They're fine, but there's not the end all be all. Okay. So yes, I do teach kids calming tools because I do believe that we all need to have things that help us cope. And the best way a parent can ever teach a calming tool is to just model it to them. Model how you deal with your anger.
Yes.
Be that calm presence to them. That's going to go further than any deep breaths. So the number one thing that I do in therapy and what I teach all the therapists that I supervise is therapy should model like what you eventually want the child to do for themselves. So you're just modeling the environment that you want the child to do. So you're just modeling being calm. You're modeling maybe taking some calming breaths. Like, let's say the child's screaming at you in therapy and you're just like, oof, it feels like there's a lot going on in the room right now. I think I'm just going to take a couple breaths, just calm myself down.
Yep.
So you're just modeling. You're always modeling what you want your child to do, and that's how they're going to learn. And yeah, we have resources that teach tons of different ways. Some angry kids need to push on a wall, or they need an outlet to kick a ball, or to slap their hand on some pots and pans as drums.
Yep. We have a whole toolkit on activities and different things you can do with kids.
So I'm not dismissing that. I have a whole toolkit on that. Yep. But I will say the greatest thing that you can do is just do those things yourself, and your child will follow suit.
For sure. And the research definitely agrees with you on that. Everything I found was saying that the parents or caregiver who models. Children always look to their parent as the model for how to live life. So if you are calm and in most circumstances you're showing what you want, they will eventually sort of learn the same thing.
Yeah.
That's all the research was showing that too.
I wonder if we need to do another episode on like, how do I become a less angry parent or something like that? Because I think a lot of this, people will be like, okay, this is good, but I just can't stop yelling at my kids.
Do we not have one on that?
I think we've definitely done some on yelling. We'll try and link what we have in the show
yeah.
notes.
If you could give parents just one takeaway from everything we've talked about today about angry children, what would that one thing be?
Okay, I'll be a little cheesier on this, but just say there's so much hope for your angry child. Don't write them off. Don't label them as angry. There's so much hope for them. There's so much we can do to support them, and they don't have to be labeled angry for the rest of their lives. So don't feel like you're stuck with this right now. And a lot of it, might be genetic. It might be this temperament, and we can give you tools.
Yep.
Or not just we, but
Help you set up the environment.
Yeah. The environment can be set up for success for your angry child. So please continue to have hope for them and continue to seek out tools like this episode today to support them, and know that it won't necessarily be this hard forever.
Perfect. I love it.
Beautiful.
That's a great way to end the episode. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. This was a fantastic episode. And like we said, we are working on a course. I'm not sure if it's out or not.
Yeah, we'll see if it is by the time we put this out.
If it's out, it'll be in the show notes. If it's not, stay tuned. But we love this topic, and let us know if you want more. Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop. And if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we will talk to you again next week.